Great. Thank you so much, Lynette. Thank you for having me this evening on Learn the Birds. It's always a privilege. It's a little bit surreal to give a talk online, but it's wonderful to be here nonetheless. And hello to everyone from around the world, which is really exciting to have such a global audience this evening. So yes, thank you for that introduction, Lynette. I will indeed be talking about my current research project, which is my PhD, looking at secretary birds, particularly in regards to the effect of climate change and how these birds live and survive in the hotter parts of their range. So I call this talk the Secretarybird Diaries. I guess it's as much a diary of their lives as of my life studying them. And that's what we're going to be going through this evening. So let me just get the slides going. As I mentioned, this is part of my PhD research project. I'm supervised by two former members of BirdLife South Africa, Melissa Whitecross and Christian Brink, as well as Susie Cunningham and Andrew McKechnie, who are the principal investigators for a research group called the Hot Birds Research Project. I'm very fortunate to be funded for this work by the Rafford Foundation, as well as the NRF. So I would just like to start with a bit of context on raptors on the global scene. This is a paper published in 2018, looking at the state of the world's raptors. And if we look at the top part of this graph, it shows the different groups. So on the far left is all raptors or all birds of prey, and then it's kind of divided into the different groups. We have owls, we have eagles, falcons, vultures, etc. And so what they've done is they've divided each group according to the status, their IUCN status. So whether they are least concern or vulnerable or endangered. And so you can see at the top there how that's broken up into the different colors. And if we look at the top part of the graph, it doesn't look too bad. We can see that for most of the groups, a lot of their members are within the least concern or near threatened categories. Aside from, of course, the vultures, for whom it is very well documented that they are in a lot of trouble at the moment. So you can see there lots of species that are endangered and critically endangered. But generally, it doesn't look too bad for the other groups. However, if we look at the bottom graph that's in black and gray, we can see that most of the groups have 50% or more in the black. And this means that their populations are decreasing. So this is a proportion of the species in each group with a population that's decreasing. And what that means is as their numbers decline, they will start to fall into more threatened categories. So a bird that was vulnerable, if it continued to decline, will become endangered and critically endangered before ultimately it could go extinct. And so what we anticipate is seeing that the top part of the graph with the colors, those proportions are going to start going in a direction that we don't want them to. In other words, we're going to see more birds in the orange and the red. So to bring it down or back to my study species, the secretary bird, this is a fantastic photo taken by one of our hosts, Lynette Rudman, in the Addo Elephant National Park, framed by two mega herbivores. And I just want to touch on exactly that, just sort of how iconic this species is. So something I wasn't properly aware of until the last few years is that it's well represented on our coat of arms. This is South Africa's national coat of arms. And we can see the secretary bird there with its wings spread, symbolizing protection over the nation. So it clearly has a very prominent place in the sort of imagination of South Africans. There was also a National Geographic edition published in 2018 looking at why birds matter. And what's pretty cool is there are about 10,000 living species of birds in the world. So they had 10,000 to choose from. And who did they go with? None other than the secretary bird. Just showing that on a global sort of scale, this bird really has very much a flagship status for birds. So unfortunately, this is one of the birds that is in decline. It would have fallen into one of those categories from an earlier graph. There's been a lot of research around its range. So secretary birds occur in sub-Saharan Africa. They don't occupy places like true forest. So you can see that places like the Democratic Republic of Congo, they're pretty much absent. And also they don't go into the Sahara Desert, but this is their range globally. And what these surveys have found are some very, very alarming declines. In West Africa and East Africa, 99 and 94% declines in the numbers of secretary birds observed, so potentially crashing populations there. And South Africa not doing much better, between 75 and 80% for surveys that have taken place across this region. What this means is that a species that in 2004 was classified by the IUCN and Red List as least concern, the species was upgraded in 2011 to vulnerable, and then most recently again to endangered in 2020. And this is for the global population, reflecting this research that has been done, showing that their numbers are in some cases plummeting. So very, very alarming trends for this iconic species. Just to hone in on the South African context, there has been a red data book update published actually very recently. I think it was a couple of weeks ago even. I was privileged to contribute to this, ironically, on a different species that I studied for my master's, the Rudd's lark. But a colleague of mine, Cassie Carstens, who is the BirdLife South Africa Conservation Secretary Bird Conservation Officer, he did the assessment for the secretary bird. And we can see here that the trends are decreasing, but that regionally we've classified the secretary bird as vulnerable. So in South Africa, its status is not quite as dire as in other parts of the range, but still of some concern to be considered vulnerable. And I would really encourage anyone who's interested in threatened birds and what affects these birds and why they are in the state that they are in, to go over to BirdLife and check out this red data book. It's really, it hasn't been published in hard copy, but it's been very nicely done online and very user friendly, and some fascinating accounts of the different species in South Africa, Lesotho, and Swaziland or Eswatini that are facing some level of threat. So off the back of these trends observed in South Africa, BirdLife South Africa established their Secretary Bird Conservation Project back in 2010. So this is the team that's been involved in that. On the left is Ernst Retief and Hanneline Smith-Robinson, and they were joined by Melissa Whitecross and Christian Brink, who are two of my supervisors for my project, as I mentioned. And most recently, Cassie Carstens has taken over as the Secretary Bird Conservation Officer. And they put some tracking devices for the first time on secretary birds, and they published a very interesting study on the dispersal dynamics. So this is when the young birds leave the nest, looking at where they go, how long they spend in certain areas. And one of the most interesting findings was that these young birds go on this odyssey, but ultimately return to the area where they hatched as chicks, presumably to try and find a mate and start a family in that same natal range. So this is super cool, novel research that has come out of the BirdLife South Africa Secretary Bird Project. And Cassie is currently at the helm doing some more cool stuff, which hopefully he'll get to share with you guys at some point in the future. So this is part of that project. It's a nest database. I was chatting to Lynette before I started the talk that this is something that anyone can actually contribute to. BirdLife have put out an open call that if you find a secretary bird nest, just to log it, the GPS coordinates, and submit it. And it's something that I've been contributing to over the past couple of years. So it's quite interesting to see where these birds breed and where people are observing them breeding. And this is reflected in their species distribution map. So this was published by Alan Lee last year, and it's kind of, well, it's based on observations through projects like the South African Bird Atlas Project, iNaturalist, and other platforms. And this is essentially giving us a likelihood of occurrence where we might expect to find secretary birds. And I find this map fascinating. I don't think that there are any birds that have a similar distribution in our country. It's patchy. We can see that they seem to prefer the grasslands of the interior, the Free State, parts of KZN, Eastern Cape, and the Northern Cape. But then they've got an interesting kind of pocket in the Overberg in the Western Cape, and also up the West Coast. And then fascinatingly, they seem to really enjoy the Kalahari Desert. So we can see there right up into the Kgalagadi Transfrontier Park, very high reporting rate for secretary birds. So based on that and the theme of the Hot Birds Research Project, which is to look at birds in arid environments, this was my first target area for my research. I wanted to go up there and monitor the nests and see what was happening with birds and those birds. And so Cassie and I set off, and we followed up on some known nest sites. This is Cassie's ingenious method for checking these nests. This is a long window cleaning pole with a GoPro on the end or a cell phone. And so we could check out these secretary bird nests and see if there was anything in them or what condition they were in. Which helped because they were typically on the top of these rather inaccessible thorn bushes, which is what secretary birds prefer in many cases for their breeding sites. Unfortunately, we did not find any active nests, and I kept in touch with other surveyors from companies like the Endangered Wildlife Trust, and it just seemed like that particular year, the birds of the Kalahari, the secretary birds of the Kalahari, should I say, didn't breed. I think it was so hot and dry, they did not return to the known nest sites. So I kind of had to go to plan B. Fortunately, this was possible, and I'm going to highlight here on the map. It doesn't look as good as maybe other parts of their range, but this is the Huntham area of the Northern Cape, sort of Calvinia, Lourisfontein, Nieuwoudtville, if you're familiar with that part of the world. And I had a local champion there, Francois van der Merwe, who's been a lifelong bird enthusiast and is a conservationist and sheep farmer in that district. And he said, look, I know there are secretary birds breeding here. You're welcome to come and have a go at studying them. So that's what I did. So once again, we set off on a recce, checked out a few nests, and at first we were not having any joy. But this just gives you an idea of the landscape. So these beautiful Karoo scenes, and you just find one round bush in the middle of kind of flat land. And that's where the secretary birds would be nesting. But after some searching, we were eventually able to find some active nests. So there's Francois and Cassie observing a nesting site, and we were thrilled to discover that they were in fact breeding that year in the Huntham. So that's a young secretary bird kind of checking out what might be going on overhead. So just to return to the Hot Birds research project, and one of the main themes of this research project and all the projects that have come before me is breeding in the heat. So what is the effect of environmental temperature on nestling survival and fitness? And this can be direct and indirect. So the nestlings will have their own experience of heat. There will be direct solar radiation experience, especially in the case of secretary birds. And then there'll be indirect effects. So the parents of chicks in hot and arid areas will have to contend with these conditions and perhaps not be able to provide as much food for their chicks on hot days as they would otherwise. And so there could be an indirect effect of temperature. And what's been found in many cases is that there are, as a result, sublethal effects for the nestlings. So there may not be mortality of young birds on the nest. They may not die directly as a result of higher temperatures. But when they fledge, when they leave the nest, they are not as fit as they would be. And this has impacts down the line for whether they will survive in the wild and whether they'll survive to reproduce in the wild. And this has consequences for at a population level. If you're not producing chicks that are able to go and reproduce themselves, you will in time see declines in the population. And they can have potentially severe impacts. Nick Pattinson, who was a couple of years ago in the Hot Birds research project, he did his PhD on the yellow-billed hornbill, and he actually published on the collapse of breeding success in desert hornbills over the course of a decade due to high environmental temperatures. So he found that these birds simply were not successfully raising chicks, or the chicks were not surviving. And this is a relatively common and widespread species across a number of habitats. So it is a worry that they are not doing well in the desert part of their range, but they do occur in good numbers elsewhere. But you can imagine if it's a desert specialist, or if it's a species that's for whatever reason already endangered, that losing a whole population or losing the breeding success of a population could be extremely dire. So I set off to start monitoring these secretary birds in the Karoo, in the Huntham. This is with Francis de Kock, who's is from my host family out there near California. And we set up trail cameras on active nests. And I didn't really know what to expect or what the quality was going to be like. I have done camera trapping on other species, but typically large mammals where you can just whack a stake in the ground and be relatively sure of success. This was a new ball game, trying to get cameras correctly positioned to monitor secretary birds. And I'll never forget downloading the first batch of photos and videos and being absolutely blown away by what we were able to collect, and I'm going to show you one of those first videos that I first looked at. I am hopeful that this is going to play, and you'll be able to see for the first time, I think, behind the veil, sort of the intimate scene of secretary birds with a chick. So it's the female on the left. She's been spending time on the nest, and this is just after the male has returned to the nest. She's looking pretty hungry, but he's probably got food for the chick, and we'll be doing a nest takeover, so he'll come and spend time. At this stage, one parent or another will typically be on the nest. The female realizes he hasn't brought her anything, so she decides she's going to go and find some food for herself. And off she goes. So it is very special to be able to sort of see behind the scenes, as I mentioned, and to start getting the first look, like really close up of what's happening inside these nests. And so this next video is actually the same scene, if we can call it that. After the female has left, the male now wants to provide food for the chick. And secretary birds, as is pretty well known, are terrestrial hunters. They're famous for catching snakes, of which there are plenty in the Karoo. And so the adults will go and forage, and they will then ingest their prey pretty much whole, and they will come and regurgitate that food for the chick. So in other birds of prey, they typically bring the prey in their talons and may even tear it up or bring pieces for their chicks. Secretary birds are a little bit different. They regurgitate this prey pretty much whole, and the chick has to figure out what to do with that. We'll see that happening here. So watch closely, and you'll maybe be able to see what this adult has brought. So pretty gruesome, but the chick didn't mind, and it swallowed one of the rats pretty much whole and was on its way to swallowing a second rat that had been regurgitated. And you may have noticed there was a whole snake, a small green snake, I'm not sure of the species, that had also been regurgitated. So some diet studies have been done of the secretary birds before, most actually from the Kruger National Park. So this was pretty cool to see what was being provided to chicks in a totally different habitat. And we saw a lot of snakes and rodents being provided to the offspring. Next video also from this nest, and this is something that's of particular interest to me because we don't quite know how the chicks cope in the heat. And this showed some fascinating insights into what happens between parents and offspring in high temperatures. You can see this was taken at, I'm not sure if you can see there, but it was 2 p.m. in the afternoon, so almost the hottest part of the day. And the camera was reading 35 degrees. So we can see that both the chick and the adult actually adjust their position so that the chick is in the shade of its parent. And from here, it just flops down. So really cool insight into shade provision by an adult. You can see the adult is not panting, his beak is not open. he's kind of just enduring this solar radiation. But the chicks are smaller, they don't quite have the same feather coverage yet, and so they're panting a lot quicker and more frequently. And so this little bit of shade that their parent can provide in a nest environment that is otherwise entirely unshaded is critical. And I'm still in the process of quantifying, how much shade and for how long do they behave in this way. I just want to go over to another nest, also this one north of Calvinia. And these are much larger chicks. They're almost full grown at this point. And this was a nest we found when these birds were actually half grown. So I quickly got a camera onto them as well. And 3 is the maximum that secretary birds can raise. So this pair has done extremely well. It looks pretty green in the background, so I think conditions were good. And they were able to raise 3 chicks to fledging stage. And typically when the nestings get to about this size, they will have a really good chance of fledging. So the parents have pretty much done their job at this point. Not guaranteed, as we'll get to a bit later, but it was great to see 3 healthy chicks pretty much close to fledging. And what's really cool is that these birds have never left the nest, so they've not practiced flying outside of the nest or hunting. And we see both of those exercises being done in the nest. So I don't have a video of this, but we actually see them practicing stomping. So what they'll do to snakes when they encounter them or any other prey items. You see these juvenile birds actually kicking out on the nest, not at anything in particular. They just have this instinct that they know they're going to need to use those powerful legs to kill prey. So you'll actually see them practicing that kicking. But what I did get a clip of is the middle bird, who must be the oldest sibling, maybe hatched first, or she, should I say. On a breezy day, we found that they would use the little draft to give them a bit of lift and practice flying before they actually left the nest. So you can see that here. I particularly like the way that his siblings are just staring up at him like, what are you doing? They don't all fledge at the same time. In fact, they often fledge a few days or even a week or 2 apart. So this bird would have been ahead of its siblings. Some of you keen-eyed observers may have noticed a tracking device on its back, and that's what I'm going to get to next. So part 2 of my project is dispersal dynamics. As I mentioned, BirdLife have published a study on these young birds and their journeys across the landscape. What I'm particularly interested in is how temperature affects that, obviously in keeping with my theme of the effects of heat on the species. So we are looking at, as the birds move through the landscape, do they move more or less at given temperatures, and how does it generally affect them? So we have tagged some birds, and this is a little picture of me doing that under Melissa's supervision. So we have these really small GPS trackers, and we sort of tie it in a backpack formation using Teflon harness. And it's never been recorded to have any ill effects on the birds. It's very lightweight. It's less than 50 grams. And we have to get to them at about 9 weeks or younger, while they're still in the nest. That's when we were able to go and grab them. I climb up on a ladder and I scoop them up. Fortunately, this is a species that doesn't fight back until it's a bit older, so they kind of just cower, and I'm able to scoop them up, and we process them as quickly as possible and put them back on the nest. While we're there, we also take some morphological measurements. This is kind of good ornithological practice. So we measure their beak, their head, their wing, their tail, etc. And so this is here I am working with Susie Cunningham, who's the director at the Fitzpatrick Institute and one of my supervisors, and taking some measurements before this chick goes back on the nest. And what we can potentially do is, if you've taken measurements throughout the course of a bird's nestling phase, we'll be able to see how well it grows in relation to temperature. It's still something I'm figuring out whether I'll be able to do for secretary birds, but we do have some measurements during this time. And so you can start to get an idea of if temperature has affected their growth rate and subsequently their fitness when they leave the nest. So some of the cool stuff is this is some of the initial tracks that my secretary birds have recorded. What's fascinating here is that this is a journey of between 600 and 700 kilometers that they've completed in a matter of days. So these are two sisters that came off that nest that I showed you a couple of slides ago with the bigger birds. And interestingly, although they've gone in almost exactly the same direction, they left 2 weeks apart. So it's not like they both took off together. Both of them just woke up one day and decided this was where they wanted to head to. So we're still not sure what drives this instinct. Could be conditions, could be some sense of good foraging grounds in that direction. But in this picture, we can see that one of them ended up still in the Northern Cape around Kuruman and Katu, and one had crossed over into the Northwest province. This was a bird that clearly saw the light and decided to head down to the Eastern Cape. So in a totally different direction, not from the same nest, but the same area, and a nest not too far north of the other nest. And we can see here that she headed sort of east and south, down past Aberdeen, Pearston, up to Craddock, and then was heading again in a northerly direction when unfortunately the tracker failed. So we're not sure if the bird was killed, or I think more likely that the tracking device went out of range or ran out of battery. And unfortunately, we didn't get the rest of the track for this individual, but it was still very interesting to see that it had decided to move in a totally different direction to other birds from its area. So I want to touch on something that happened this past season, which I wasn't expecting. As I mentioned, when the birds get to sort of 8 weeks old, there's a really good chance they're going to fledge. You know, the parents have done the hard part. They've fed them. They've raised them to a stage where they've got all their adult feathers, and they're a couple of weeks away from fledging. And so I'd planned to go and tag this particular individual, who I have nicknamed Drickus, which will become apparent why. And so myself and Meg Murgatroyd from Hawk Watch International, we went to go and tag this individual. And when I climbed up the ladder and found this bird, I could see something was wrong. It was already about 8 or 9 o'clock in the morning. It should have been active and waiting for its parents to return. Instead, it was sitting in the middle of the nest with its head tucked back into its wings. And when I picked it up, it felt like a husk. It was alive, but it was literally a skeleton. And I could then see when it did move its head that the skin on its face was a very unhealthy sort of yellow-green or greeny gray almost, compared to that bright orange that we would have expected. And when we weighed it, it weighed only 1.5 kilograms. And to give you some idea, at that stage, a secretary bird juvenile should be weighing about 3 kilograms. So it was 50% of the weight it should have been. And fortunately, I had a camera on this nest. And when I checked the footage, all that we could ascertain was that this youngster had not been fed for 9 days. So no adults had visited the nest. And I just found it astounding that it had survived with no food and no water for 9 days. I think we may have found it on its last legs, its last day on Earth. I don't know what happened to the adults, whether they were killed or whether the conditions, this was already in February. They may have found conditions so hot and dry that they felt they couldn't provide for themselves as well as the chick, but they just stopped coming back. And so normally you want to let nature take its course, but given that it's an endangered species and was pretty much going to die, we decided to rescue it. And we took it in for one night, gave it some raw eggs and a bit of water. And then it was taken in by Ronel Fasahi from the Endangered Wildlife Trust. Ronel's got, I think, about 30 years of looking after various creatures, including birds of prey. And so she was able to do a miraculous job of reviving this bird and getting it back on its feet And from there, it was actually flown by the battaliers, which is a group of pilots who conservation minded, I guess, and offer their services for conservation projects. And they flew this bird to the Dahlstrom Raptor and Rehabilitation Center. And here's a lovely photo of Drickus. So I've called him Drickus because he's a fighter after our own South African MMA champion. And this is Drickus arriving at Dahlstrom in the safe hands of Magdali, who's one of the center managers. She and Frith have a huge amount of experience working with birds like this. And what's interesting is 2 other birds had come in as well, same age, same condition. And so they had 3 birds on their hands. But I'm happy to report that a couple of months later, all 3 youngsters are doing really well. They have a very large, long aviary that they're in where they can run around and practice flying. And the intention is to release these birds back into the wild. Not yet. Frith and Mac are going to keep them over winter just because it's going to be quite tricky to just drop them in the wild to forage for themselves in winter. But come springtime, if everything's looking good, these birds will be released again, which is great. So, moving on from birds in wild birds, should I say, to part 3 of my project, which is quantifying heat response. This is also something that the Hot Birds Research Project has done a lot of over the past 10 plus years. And that is looking at various species of birds and their response to temperature in a controlled environment. So through a process called flow-through respirometry, we monitor body temperature, resting metabolic rate, and evaporative water loss in response to rising air temperature. So it's something we simulate. So how it works is we construct a metabolic chamber, airtight, with gas exchange analyzers at the outlet, and we test the birds at different temperatures that they would be likely to experience in the wild, and also high temperatures to see, what are their thermal tolerances. And this has typically been done for smaller birds, mostly passerines, which require obviously smaller chambers, although my colleague Bianca Coulson has worked with trumpeter hornbills. So in South Africa, that was the largest bird that had been assessed with this process, although overseas, the McQueen's bustard in Asia was also assessed, and that weighs 1.2 kilograms. But dealing with the secretary bird weighing pretty much 3 times as much as that, it was the largest bird that's ever been assessed in this fashion. And so because of that, we had to go into uncharted territory and construct a chamber that was big enough to house a secretary bird. And this is a schematic that Bianca drew up, which I think is pretty cute, showing the sort of concept of a bird being in a chamber. We worked with engineers at the Groenkloof campus at the University of Pretoria, Lo Kampman and his team, and they built this box for us. And it actually took many months to refine the chamber. We did some trials with secretary birds at the Dahlstrom Center. So once again, we relied on the goodwill of Frith and Mac at Dahlstrom, who had captive secretary bird adults that unfortunately could not be released for various reasons. One due to eyesight, one had a long-term injury, and so forth. And so we had access to adult birds, because adult secretary birds are incredibly difficult to capture in the wild. We actually haven't devised a successful method. As I mentioned, we will target the young birds at about 8 weeks old on the nest. But once they leave the nest, very difficult to catch a secretary bird. So it is great to have access to some birds at the Dahlstrom Raptor Center. And so we were able to take this chamber there, see that they fitted, that they were relaxed. And although they're a little bit agitated when they go in, they pretty quickly settle down. And then we also had to figure out how to warm the box up. And my target temperature range was between 28 degrees and 46 degrees, which, as I mentioned, is temperatures that they would experience, especially in the Kalahari, would probably exceed that. So that's kind of the range we were looking to test these birds at. And we also had to devise a method for reading their body temperature. So they each got a small microchip, like you might put in a pet dog or a cat, that in this case, that reads body temperature. And then we had a elaborate coil antenna system in sort of around the outside or the inside of the box that can read body temperature, so we can see what's happening with the bird's body temperature for its well-being, and also for obviously for our study. So some behind the scenes shots. On the left is Mark Freeman and Bianca Coulson, who worked closely with me on this project. And that's us setting up a infrared camera on the left. And then, of course, we needed to see if the body temperature tags would work. So Bianca's holding one of those, and we put her in the box. I did spend some time in there myself, but Bianca definitely did the tougher one of spending a good hour in there to see that we were getting effective readings of the microchip. And so eventually we were able to transport this chamber from Pretoria to Dahlstrom and successfully run three individuals, which really was a culmination of a lot of work. And so I was particularly chuffed that we were able to successfully get measurements. We got as high as 44 degrees, at which point the chamber actually struggled to heat up any further. So I was hoping to get to 46, but I'm counting 44 as a win. And so what I'm doing literally at the moment is writing up a paper on our findings, which is pretty exciting. Just to touch on some preliminary results, we are finding what we may have expected to find, and that a large-bodied bird that can endure or can survive and thrive in hot and arid environments doesn't show very pronounced effects of temperature up to what we tested, as I mentioned, 44 degrees. So we see that body temperature does rise in response to rising air temperature, but that this is not, well, what we say is that they defended body temperature below lethal limits. So secretary birds comfortably kept their body temperature below sort of 40, 41 degrees, which is comfortable for a bird. They can go up to about 45 degrees, but they don't want to let their body temperature get that high. So even at 44 degrees, they were still keeping their body, 44 degrees air temperature, they kept their body temperature at 40 degrees. With evaporative water loss, so how much water the bird's putting out, we also saw significant increases in response to air temperature, but we didn't see any major spikes in their water loss. They did start panting at about 38 degrees, but we didn't see a massive increase in their evaporative water loss, suggesting that they have a very controlled release of water in order to keep their body temperature down. I don't want to go into this too much. As I said, I'm working on it at the moment. Watch the space, I guess. I'm aiming to publish these results this year. So then you'll be able to see a full set of results of what we found. So just to move on to the last part of my study, which is also something for the future, and this is predicting secretary bird survival under future climate change scenarios. So essentially, I want to take the data I've collected from my other chapters and feed it into a predictive model for what we might expect to happen to the secretary bird range under future climate change scenarios. So there's some fairly alarming projections for the future in terms of how areas are going to heat up, in particular places like the Kalahari Desert. And so this is a study already done by Durham University and BirdLife International. There's kind of a broad level assessment of various species, looking at what they think might occur if you look at current range or current distribution and how future climate scenarios might affect that. I'm hoping to kind of provide more detailed data to back this up. So I will be, as I mentioned, using data from my other chapters to feed into a model to see just how this might affect where secretary birds occur and where it might get too hot for them to survive. And this may well have consequences for conservation. So we may need to protect secretary birds in other strongholds that are not as predicted to be as susceptible to rising temperatures. So that's all from me this evening. This project has a lot of people that it wouldn't have been possible without. I would like to thank my supervisors, my field assistants, Frans van der Merwe, who's my champion in the Huntam, the De Kock family who host me there, obviously our two major partners, BirdLife South Africa and the Hot Birds Research Group. The landowners without whom I wouldn't have a study site at all. So they've been very generous in allowing me onto their land. As well as Letitia Steinberg from BirdLife Northern Gauteng, who sponsored my tracking devices for this project. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Wes. That was really great. Okay, now let's go to the questions. Letitia asks, could Wesley please share his view on the value of tracking devices in supporting conservation of these iconic species?
Thank you, Lynette. You're a bit soft of my speaker, but I think I got that from Letitia asking about the value of tracking devices for conservation. Yeah. Is that Letitia Steinberg asking that question?
That's right. Yes.
Fantastic. I'm so glad you've joined, Letitia. So yeah, I mean, I can't say enough about the value of tracking devices. It's allowed us unprecedented insights into bird behavior, and especially for far-ranging birds like the secretary bird, where we simply don't know what happens after they fledge. And we are getting, these are being widely used now by a variety of companies and NGOs. And I know there's a lot of work on vultures and martial eagles and various species that are particularly endangered. And so to be able to track these birds is valuable on a number of fronts. For vultures, we can see if poaching incidents have occurred. For martial eagles, we can see the use of power lines as nesting sites. For my secretary birds, we can see just how far they go, where they go. And for me, with the accelerometers that are in these tracking devices, I'm hoping to extract kind of more fine-scale behavior as they move through the landscape. And I've tried to follow secretary birds, and I know sometimes they can be well behaved, but they can be very skittish as well. So it can be incredibly difficult to track them manually, if you want to call it that. And so these tracking devices are just, yeah, you can't really beat them for the kind of information they provide.
Thanks, Wes. And Letitia was also wanting to know if pied crows harass these secretary birds. Are they a problem?
Yes, so it's something that I would really like to get a better handle on, but I have footage and photos of pied crows harassing secretary birds. If the adult stays put and sits on the eggs or the chicks, the crows won't go so far as to actually push her off, but they will hang around in the hopes that they'll get a gap. And then if the parents are away when the chicks are a bit bigger, we've got videos. Actually, the BBC did a documentary that I'm hoping will come out probably only next year down here in the Eastern Cape. And they've got this incredible footage of pied crows dive bombing young secretary birds on the nest. So I think that there is almost certainly mortality associated with pied crows for the species.
Yeah, there seem to be so many pied crows these days, far more than there used to be. Okay, Wes Sid asks, does the use of poles to check nests not disturb or stress the birds? And how do you ensure minimum disturbance to them?
Yeah, it's a good question, Sid. We don't always have ideal solutions for monitoring approaches. You can also I've used a drone before. A drone is quite effective. But what we found is even if we do happen to flush an adult bird off the nest, we have monitored after departing those adults, and they return quickly, within 10, 20 minutes to that nest. So yes, there is a measure of invasiveness of the strategy of this method, but it does give us a quick look at, are there eggs, are there chicks, is it an empty nest, what's the condition of that nest, which we can't really get, in other ways. So yeah, it is a level of disturbance, but we haven't found any detrimental effects from this method.
Thanks. And Nikki asks, given that it's not possible to recapture the bird in its adulthood, what happens to the tracker that was fitted to it while it was a chick?
Yeah, also a very good question. Thank you. So yeah, it would be amazing if we could recapture the adults, because we could also use tracking devices that store the data rather than have to transmit them via satellite. So that's costly and less effective than devices where you can download the data after recapturing your study species. And of course, there's a question of what happens to that device. So what we do with the secretary birds is, although the harness is made from Teflon, we sew the where they connect with dental floss, which is pretty strong, but eventually will wear through. And so that's the weak point on the device. And so the idea is it'll last as long as that device will last, but not indefinitely. It will eventually wear through and drop off. And yeah, we won't recover that. Well, we may be lucky to recover that device if the tracker is still running, but if the tracker has died, then we lose that device.
Thanks. And Letitia asks again, in your view, what are the critical initiatives to be embarked upon to conserve the birds?
Presumably the secretary bird specifically. Yeah, I mean, getting a better idea of what's happening with them, what the threats are, is the first step. We need to know if their breeding success is declining. Why is it declining, and what can we do? It's very difficult with a far-ranging species like this, because you can, as with many raptors, you can protect a bird inside a national park or a private game reserve, but they are going to leave the so-called safety of that area. So for me, I think to protect the breeding sites is a good step. So we know that those breeding sites are not going to be subject to. Yeah, I mean, secretary birds don't suffer too much from poaching like vultures do. But that's, I think, a good start, to know that your breeding sites are in protected areas. And then, yeah, I guess we're in the stage of gathering as much information as we can to see what the impacts, or what the threats are, and how we could mitigate this. Sorry, it's not a very articulate answer for exactly what we can do yet.
Okay, and then Elba asks, when you lose the signal on a bird, do you have a backup system like a color ring?
Yes.
Do you ring the birds?
So we do ring the birds as well. So they can either have color rings, but we've typically used metal rings. So yeah, that's pretty commonly used. And so Melissa has been the ringer for my project, although I'm hoping to become qualified to ring myself. And so if someone was to see a bird, or in the event that a bird died, they could see where that bird came from. And that was, before tracking devices, the only way we could actually gather information on bird movement. If a bird is ringed in the Northern Cape and someone saw it or found it in the Eastern Cape, we at least know the minimum distance that bird has traveled. So that's still valuable, absolutely, as a backup.
Thanks. And David comments, excellent presentation on an iconic species. I just attended a donor conference at Cornell Lab. It was mentioned during one of the presentations of the secretarybird's plight when discussing overall bird population declines. So it seems to be quite well known worldwide that their numbers are dropping.
Yeah, thanks. Thank you, David, for the kind words, and very interesting to know that this species came up, far from its home. As I mentioned at the start, it's a very charismatic species. So, I think birds like this are certainly in the headlines at the moment.
Great presentation. Thank you so much. This is from Ariane. I hope I've said her name right. Is there a collaboration with neighboring countries like Botswana and Namibia in the efforts to protect the secretary birds? And if so, in which way?
Yeah, so it's certainly something we need to be considering. It's a little bit beyond my scope, I guess, doing a research project specifically based in South Africa. But I'm sure there must be links with organizations like the Endangered Wildlife Trust. I know that Prof. Arjun Amar from University of Cape Town has done surveys in Botswana. So there is work being done there as well. I'm not aware of any links to Namibia, but I speak under correction. There could well be initiatives that's cross borders, because it's a good point. These birds are not going to stick to one country, and we kind of are looking at this as a sub-region population rather than something limited to an individual country.
Are there any more questions before we wrap up? Yeah, lots of people have said thanks very much, Wes, for a brilliant presentation. So yeah,
thanks, Lynette.
Very, very interesting.
Yeah, thanks indeed. And before everybody leaves, just a reminder that next month on the 17th of July, Etienne Murray, one of the co-founders of Learn the Birds, is going to be talking about the birding mind revisited. So it's about the mindset of birding and what it means and all of those things. So it's very different from the focus on the bird that we've just had. And then that one, we're going to focus on the birder because of the potential impact that the birder has on the birds. So that will be an interesting talk, I'm sure, as well.
Nikki quickly says, coincidentally, she recently saw a pair of secretary birds nesting on a stretch between Wepener and Smithfield. Do you know about that one, Wes?
Oh, fantastic. No, Cassie would be the guy to ask about that. But I don't know if you can leave a contact detail of mine in the chat. Otherwise, maybe Lynette, I can send you the call for submissions of nest sites observations. You can share it with the audience or via email or something.
Yeah. Nikki, can you maybe send me the GPS coordinates of that nest? You're a Facebook friend of mine, so yeah, please do that. And then I'll pass it on to Wesley.
Yeah, I mean, actually, anyone's welcome to go onto BirdLife's website. I'm sure there is a link there in fact, there's a whole portal for submitting these sightings. So you could cut me out as a middleman and go straight to BirdLife. That'd be amazing.
Fantastic. That's great. I think we spoke earlier. If there's anybody that knows of someone who can give a presentation like Wesley, if they're studying birds or if they any bird related topic, please drop Derek a message or put something in the chat box below and with your contact details, and we'll contact you. We're always looking for interesting speakers like Wesley. It was really great.
Cool. Thank you very much, Lynette and Derek, for having me.